Hi, thank you so much for that introduction, Jenny. It's really wonderful to be here with you all. I think this is definitely one of the positives to have come out of the pandemic, if anything, is this ability to join you all in Australia, all the way from Western-super-Mare in southwest England. So thank you very much for the invitation. As Jenny said, I'm co-leading a national study of bereavement during the COVID-19 pandemic, and I'm going to be speaking about this study today. I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the background, what we know around COVID-19 and bereavement. I'm going to give you an outline of our national research study, and I'm going to flag some of the emerging findings from this research around some of the challenges of bereavement during the pandemic. So I have be talking a little bit about some data about traumatic end-of-life experiences, disruption to the grieving process, support needs and difficulties accessing formal support, disruption of social networks and relationships with others. And I've just put that little picture there, take care of yourself, to remind myself to say, some of the data, perhaps not so much what I'm presenting today, because I'm not focusing so much on the qualitative data, but some of the data is quite distressing. So just a warning there, please do take care of yourself and take a break if you need to. I'm also going to flag just briefly at the end some of the work we've been doing to try and ensure this research has impact in terms of policy influencing and engagement. And also I'll talk a bit about Good Grief Festival, which is a public engagement initiative that I'm involved with. So on this slide, you can see the number of COVID-19 deaths worldwide by continent and status from Friday. And every time I present on this topic, I revisit the number of confirmed COVID-19 deaths globally, and I'm always never fail to be shocked by how quickly the numbers are still rising. It's easy to think, especially in developed country settings and advantaged country settings where we have access to the vaccine, that we're the other side of the pandemic, but the truth is actually, it's still very much raging in full force around the world. And we've really seen mass bereavement on a scale rarely seen in recent history. And there's now been over 4.1 million deaths. And on this graph, you can see confirmed cases and how chronologically the pandemic has unfolded across the world. But I think what's really easy to forget, especially in the UK, where we've had, especially at the beginning of the pandemic last year, the media are very focused on death counts, and you'd see the death counts kind of, rising in quite a frightening way each day and each week. It's easy to forget that each one of these numbers is a loved person, embedded within a family, within a community. And I think around the world now, you can see these memorials and both national and local ways of remembering people springing up. Wikipedia has a list of kind of notable people that have died during the pandemic. In the UK, St Paul's Cathedral has an initiative called Remember Me, where people can post photos and stories about the person that they loved who's died. And I think, these are the kind of initiatives around memorialization which try to give a voice to people who've died during the pandemic, who otherwise could become subsumed within these very large statistics and the numbers. And one of the aims of our research was to try to, focusing on the UK, give voice to people who've died at this really difficult time, and a time in which, death seemed to just be, happening on a scale that's very hard to comprehend. So in the UK, we've seen around a 20% increase in deaths in a year from March 2020. Around 129,000 people have died of COVID-19. And this is, of course, in addition to around 500 to 600 deaths every year, which we see in the UK. There's been some research from the States suggesting that each death during the pandemic leaves around 9 people bereaved. And if this is the case, we've actually seen over 5.5 million people bereaved in the UK during these really challenging times, and that's including COVID-19 and non-COVID-19 deaths. And of course, during the pandemic, there have been well documented now, in the media especially, these significant challenges to people who are grieving and the people who are supporting them. So right at the beginning of the pandemic, so last spring, I did some work with some colleagues trying to understand some of the risk factors which people needed to be aware of in terms of poor bereavement outcomes in COVID-19. And there are many different factors which we know are associated with these poorer bereavement outcomes. So things like prolonged grief disorder, post-traumatic stress disorder, depression, anxiety. The first of those is the person who died. So if it's a child who died or a romantic partner, people at more risk of these poorer outcomes. But also crucially, the context and experience of the death. And there are many factors here which we know from previous research are risk factors for poor bereavement outcomes, which are really relevant in COVID-19. So sudden and violent deaths, dying in the ICU, a patient dying while intubated, or a patient having severe shortness of breath, the bereaved relatives perceiving that the patient can't breathe properly, and fundamentally also not being able to say goodbye in the way that you would have wished. So we know from previous research that all of these are risk factors. In addition, there are features of the end-of-life care experience, which can be really challenging and can lead to complications further down the line. So poor communication between clinicians and relatives, a perception that the loved one didn't receive emotional support at the end of life. And if you consider the really difficult circumstances which clinicians have been operating in during the pandemic, obviously this, the best practice in end-of-life care we know has not been possible, especially, during the peak of the pandemics in the UK. Social circumstances are also important risk factors. So loss of social and community networks, living alone, loss of income and trauma, and all of these have been, likely to have been increased during the pandemic. And then finally, some of the characteristics of the person who's been bereaved. So being a female relative, being of older age and having lower education and socioeconomic status are all associated with potentially more difficult experiences in bereavement. So what was not known going back to spring last year was really, of course, what the experiences of people were going to be during the pandemic if they were bereaved. And that was one of the motivators behind the national study that we applied to funding to the Economic and Social Research Council for. And it has two main aims. So the first was to document the grief experiences, support needs and use of bereavement support by people bereaved during the pandemic. And to meet this aim, we conducted a longitudinal online survey of people bereaved since the 16th of March in the UK. So the 16th of March was when our government first started some of those social distancing and other restrictions in relation to infection control. And we're also doing qualitative interviews with a subset of the survey participants. And then the second work stream is around understanding the adaptations, challenges and innovation involved in delivering equitable bereavement support. And we are conducting cross-sectional online survey bereavement services that focusing here on community and voluntary sector bereavement services and qualitative interviews with around 10 case study organisations. And the idea of the study is to be very much feeding into policy as we go. And we want to ensure that the evidence that we come up with can inform end-of-life care processes and bereavement support during and beyond the pandemic in a very kind of real-time way. So we've been releasing interim findings kind of as we go, and we'll continue to do that. I'm going to be focusing today on the first work stream, and especially this first aspect, so the longitudinal online survey that we've been conducting. And the survey closed in January this year. So we've been analysing the baseline data, of which there's a lot. And we're also collecting data at 2 further time points, around 7 months after the death and 13 months after the death. So I'll be talking today about the baseline data that we have. So our first survey opened on the 26th of August last year, and it closed on the 5th of January, and 711 people participated. We recruited to the survey via bereavement and community organisations, social media, Good Grief Festival, which I'll talk a little bit more about later, and through national and local media coverage. I think one of the benefits of doing this research is that the media have been really interested. I mean, I say it's a benefit because it's really helped with recruitment and drawing attention to the study. I think one of the drawbacks is that it can feel quite pressured as a research team, because we have been getting kind of emails from journalists like asking for more details and more commitment to hard findings when we're still analysing the data. So that's been quite an interesting and new challenge for us. And as I said, we have follow up at 2 further time points. And just to flag as well that we released our interim data from the baseline survey on the 27th of November last year, and you can access the interim report via our website, covidbereavement.com. And we actually used the launch of those findings to generate media coverage as well, and to boost recruitment to the survey. And that was quite helpful because, as you'll see later, the survey is not nationally representative. It's quite biased, especially in terms of gender and ethnicity. So we tried to use that to try and correct that bias, which we did manage to a certain extent, but you'll see we still do have some biases in the sample. But I think what's really important to remember is that this is such a new area that the data actually is really helpful, especially in terms of looking at factors associated with some of the difficult experiences, which is what our next papers will be looking at. And we have our first preprint out. It's currently, we've just responded to reviewers' comments, so it should be out soon in a peer-reviewed journal. And this focuses on support needs and barriers to accessing support. And I'll be talking a little bit about the findings from this paper today. So here's our sample. We had 88.6% of the respondents were female and just 10.4% male. The mean age was 49.5. The range was from 18 to 90. Almost 5% were from ethnic minority backgrounds, which, as I said, is lower than we would have liked. And we did do a lot of work to try to increase that. We did quite a lot of engagement with local media, for example. But yeah, it's a bit of a shame we didn't manage to get that a little bit higher and be, so we could be more representative of those groups, especially given the disproportionate impact of COVID-19 on Black and minority ethnic groups in the UK. However, in our qualitative research, we are exploring in more detail some of the experiences of people from those backgrounds. 55.6% of the people who responded had lost a parent, so a parent had died, 21.4% a partner or spouse, and 7.6% grandparents. And the median time since death was 5 months. But we did have a huge range there. So some people completed the survey just 1 day after the death, and others up to 9 months after the death. And that kind of wide range was also why we decided that at the second and third time points, we wanted to make it more specific to the approximate number of months since the death. So we could be a little bit more specific about what we could say about people's experiences at certain points in the bereavement trajectory. 77.6% of people did not expect their loved one to die. And then the people who died, the mean age was 72.2, but we had a really wide range, again, from just 4 months gestation up to 102 years. 58% of people died in a hospital, 22% at home, 13% in a care home, and 5% in a hospice. And around 44% were of the deaths were from a confirmed or suspected COVID-19 diagnosis, and 56.2% were non-COVID conditions, including 22% cancer. So we know that end-of-life experiences play a really fundamental role in people's experiences of grief, and in the stories that they tell themselves about their loss and their bereavement. We know, for example, that those kind of narratives that we tell ourselves about the nature of the death and how it occurred are really crucial in terms of kind of meaning making. So we were really interested in understanding more about these end-of-life experiences. We found really mixed results here. So 22% of respondents said they were never involved in decisions about the care of their loved one, while another 23% said they were always involved. 18% said they were not at all informed by about the approaching death, and 32% said they were fully informed. And after the death, I think there were some quite striking findings. So 35% felt not at all supported by healthcare professionals immediately after the death, whereas 28% said they felt very or fairly well supported. 45% were not contacted by the hospital or care provider after the death, whereas 35% were contacted. And this, I think, was quite shocking. 51% were not provided with any information about bereavement support at the time of death, and 22% were provided this information at the time of death and 16% during a follow-up call. And considering the really important role that healthcare professionals provide and social care professionals play in terms of signposting to services, this was quite an important finding and really flagged that probably, often because of the stress that the professionals were under at this time, people were not being given quite basic information about where they could turn if they were struggling with their grief. So we asked people about certain difficulties that they may have experienced before and after the death that related to being bereaved during the pandemic. And we asked about 6 different items, which you can see here. When your loved one died, did you experience any of the following? Being unable to visit them, having limited contact with them, being unable to say goodbye as they would have liked, restricted funeral arrangements, social isolation and loneliness, and limited contact with other close relatives or friends. And as you can see, there was a really high proportion of people who had experienced these. Over 50% had experienced all of these. Almost everyone had experienced restricted funeral arrangements. And a really high proportion were reporting issues around not being able to see their loved ones as they would have liked to. COVID-19 deaths confirmed or suspected had a higher level of all these problems, except for funeral arrangements. And the paper that I'm working on at the moment is examining in a bit more detail differences and factors associated with being more likely to experience some of these issues. COVID-19 deaths were associated with additional stressors. So the ongoing threat of the virus, people being very afraid of catching COVID-19 themselves or passing it on to vulnerable family members. So this came out very strongly in the free text data. So here you can see a bereaved daughter saying, I fear the same will happen to me as I'm diabetic and I have 2 autistic sons, and I don't want them to go through losing their mum in the same way. I'm terrified of them going to school and getting infected. How can I grieve when I'm terrified and trying to protect them? Other issues people reported related to anger and anxiety over how the pandemic was being handled by the government in particular, and also distress caused by other people questioning the seriousness of the pandemic and not observing social distancing rules. And this came out a little bit later as well, when people were talking about whether they'd been able to access informal support from family and friends. And these very multidimensional difficulties people are experiencing really had an impact on their grief. So we used the adult attitude to grief scale to assess people's experiences of grief, and this is a 9-item scale which uses a 5-point Likert scale to appraise the relative vulnerability and resilience of a bereaved person across 3 domains of resilience, controlled, and overwhelming grief. And overall, we found borderline high levels of vulnerability and grief, with half of people experiencing high or severe levels of vulnerability in their grief. So 28% in the severe category, 23% in high, and 48% in the lower grief category here. And COVID-19 deaths, again, were associated with higher vulnerability in grief, and hospital deaths were also associated with more overwhelming grief compared to other places of death. And at T2 and T3, so 7 and 13 months after the death, in our longitudinal survey, we're also administering formal measures of traumatic grief or prolonged grief disorder, which will give us a better understanding of people's experiences of grief. Because, of course, as I said, people in this survey are bereaved at different times, whereas to assess prolonged grief disorder, you don't want to do that before 6 or 12 months after the death. So I think we'll get a lot more useful and interesting data in the subsequent rounds of the survey. So as I said, there are these really multidimensional factors at play that influence people's experiences of grief at this time. So this quote from a daughter bereaved by COVID-19, I think really shows this, how painful this is. So it was traumatizing not being able to go to the hospital, not being able to be with my sisters for support, painful having to say goodbye on video, waiting at the beginning to find out what was happening. The funeral was just myself and 2 sisters, no service or flowers, no change of clothes, dealing with agencies in lockdown, housing association wanting her home emptied within 4 weeks, which was impossible. Everything was stressful. My sisters and I have not grieved. It's like it never happened. I feel nothing but anger that this happened. And this really came out a lot in the qualitative data from the survey. So just the fact that the sheer number and types of different stresses that people were dealing with, you know, from losing their jobs to being isolated from their entire family, being stuck somewhere and unable to travel, having to say goodbye via FaceTime or make extremely difficult decisions about whether or not to go into the hospital ICU when it was permitted. You know, at the beginning of the pandemic, people were not permitted in the UK to be present at all. And that sort of changed a couple of months in. The Health Secretary made an announcement that if people were at the end of life, they would be allowed to have 1 visitor, but that obviously put very difficult decisions on families. I had to decide, you know, who was the person who was going to be allowed to go. And then on top of that, the fact that, you know, often people themselves may have been clinically vulnerable, and that whole, you know, making the judgment call there and balancing up the different risks involved, I think was, you know, extremely difficult for people, and that really comes through in the qualitative data. So we assessed support needs in 13 domains, which related to practical, emotional, and psychosocial support. And in 6 of these domains, all relating to psycho-emotional support, between 50 and 60% reported high or fairly high levels of need. So you can see that here, the top 6 here. And these were in particular dealing with my feelings about the way my loved one died, expressing my feelings and feeling understood by others, and feelings of anxiety and depression. Those were the 3 highest ones. So this suggests considerable needs for social and emotional support, as well as more formal grief-focused support. So in the survey, we asked people what support they'd been getting with their bereavement. And there were a lot of different types and combinations of support which were being used. And you can see some of the examples of these in the categories listed just here to the right of the graph. So as expected, the most common type of support was from family and friends, just under 90% of people reporting support in this area. And this was followed by online communities like Facebook groups and chat forums, which were used by around 29% of people. So this graph here shows the highest level of support accessed by the 3 low, high, and severe vulnerability groups. And it uses the tiered public health model, which I'll discuss on the next slide, with no support coloured in blue on the left-hand side here, through to formal bereavement and mental health support coloured green on the right-hand side. And we also created a combined high and severe vulnerability group who were at least 6 weeks bereaved when they completed the survey, just to check that these figures weren't skewed by the small proportion of people who completed the surveys close to death and may have been less likely to be accessing services. But as you can see, there weren't any notable differences here. And there are a couple of things that really stand out in this graph when considering unmet need. One is the small but not insignificant proportion of people reporting no support at all. So here, along here in blue, from family and friends or from services, which in the severe group was around 8%. So you can see that. And looking at the opposite right-hand side of the graph, the relatively low proportion of people, around 26%, in the high and severe groups accessing formal tier 2 or tier 3 bereavement or mental health support, of which the vast majority was individual counselling support. And this is of concern when considered against established models of bereavement care. So this triangle depicts the public health model of bereavement that you may be familiar with. So the diagram gives pre-pandemic estimates of the proportion of bereaved people in low risk, around 60% down here, moderate risk, around 30%, and high risk groups up here, as well as similar confirmed proportions from a 2015 Australian survey, which you can see in red here. I should say that these risk groups are based on indications of prolonged grief, so they're not directly comparable with our early data, but they do usefully map the different types of support needed by different risk groups. So the bottom tier, 1, the low risk group, includes universal access to information on grief and available support, as well as informal support from social and community networks. And the second tier, for those with moderate needs, includes structured, reflective support, often led by trained volunteers in individual or group settings. And then the third tier at the top includes specialist grief, mental health and psychological interventions, which should be targeted at the minority of people identified as at high risk of prolonged grief disorder. So I think one of the most striking findings at this stage of our research is the high proportion, so 74% of participants in the 2 high-risk groups who are not accessing the type of formal support which, based on this model and previous evidence, might be expected to help them. And then also this next finding here, so 29% of respondents overall in our sample reported not to have needed bereavement services because their family and friends provided them with enough support. And this is obviously quite a big difference from the 60% estimation in tier 1 of this pre-pandemic public health model. And I'll now go on to explore some of the difficulties people have faced with both formal and informal support. So what explains this relatively low uptake of formal support despite the apparently high levels of need? So we found that as many as 60% had not yet tried to access support from bereavement services, including around half of those in high-risk groups, but also that those who had sought support, 56% experienced difficulties accessing these services. And reasons selected to explain why people didn't try to access support included feeling uncomfortable asking for support or being unsure if it would be of help to them. Down here. And 15% actually said that the support they wanted wasn't available to them, and 14% reported a lack of knowledge of how to access this kind of support. So there are clear issues here around people being able to access formal support, but also feeling comfortable and confident enough to access formal support. So some of the barriers to accessing support became a lot clearer in the free text data. People wrote about their experiences of trying to access support via their GP, their family doctor, and also from bereavement services. And some people described not knowing how to get support or not being given any information, while several problems related to lack of availability. So in some cases, there were assumptions of overstretched services, which dissuaded respondents from trying to get help, whilst others, like the quote shown from the bereaved mother here, really emphasize how being placed on long waiting lists put people off and actually made their grief and anxiety even worse. Others noted experiences of unreturned calls, needing to wait a minimum period after the death, which in our data related to 6 weeks to 6 months after the death, and experiencing a sort of postcode lottery ineligibility due to how services are commissioned in the UK in some localities. So in some areas, there seemed to be quite good availability of services, where in others it was much more patchy or even non-existent. So there were also comments suggesting a lack of appropriate support. So many respondents who received telephone or web-based support described positive experiences, but there were a fair proportion who felt uncomfortable discussing sensitive and personal matters remotely, via Zoom or on the telephone. So this quote from a bereaved daughter kind of highlights this really, that as well as those issues around the type of support, there was also feelings that what they'd been through was really unique, and what they wanted was not generic bereavement support, but something specific to their COVID-19 loss. There were also needs for culturally relevant and group-specific support for those with similar experiences of bereavement, including for young widows, parents, same-sex couples, and following particular types of death. And like the quote from the bereaved grandson shown here, people also describe feeling uncomfortable seeking support, as well as feeling too upset or unable to open up to strangers, or even doubting whether bereavement support could actually help them. And people who lost elderly parents to long-term illnesses, and in some cases COVID-19, also explained how they felt less entitled or worthy of support, given the perceived greater needs of others and the heavy demand being placed on bereavement services as a result of the pandemic. So most people were supported by family and friends, but around 40% reported difficulties getting this support. So a quarter reported that their friends or family were unable to support them in the way that they wanted, and a fifth reported feeling uncomfortable asking for help from family and friends. So the pandemic itself, partly due to the social distancing, but also to do with all the other stresses that were on everyone at this time, really did seem to disrupt relationships and disrupt the sort of natural support which family and friends might have been able to provide. A number of themes were identified in the qualitative data, which explained and expanded on some of the statistics in the last slide. So the first related to difficulties connecting and communicating with friends and family and the challenges posed by social distancing and lockdown requirements. So many people described how they missed physical contact, being able to hug their friends and family, as well as difficulties talking openly about their feelings, especially over the phone or over the internet. So as seen in this quote from a bereaved cousin, being unable to meet close family and friends to share their grief also disrupted the grieving process, making the death seem surreal and harder to accept. And there was a general lack of understanding and empathy within social networks that was described. So with family and friends commonly perceived as feeling awkward and uncomfortable talking about grief or the person who died. And as in this quote here from a bereaved daughter, people also talked about how the exceptional nature of COVID-19 bereavement, including the anger associated with it, made it really difficult for other people to understand, which compounded the sense of loneliness and isolation experienced by the bereaved. And due to the widespread stress caused by the pandemic, people also worried about adding to the emotional and mental health burden of family and friends. There was a real recognition that everyone had their own issues to deal with, and people who lost elderly parents to sort of non-COVID-19 illnesses also felt inhibited about asking for help when there was sort of national crisis going on. And experiences of others disregarding regulations and questioning the pandemic or sharing conspiracy theories on social media were also deeply distressing and further contributed to these feelings of isolation and alienation. So some conclusions and recommendations from our research so far. I think first of all, the findings highlight the exceptionally difficult set of experiences which people have been going through during the pandemic. We've really highlighted how there's this, how the disruption to the end of life experiences and death and mourning practices all kind of come together, and this multidimensional impact on grief results in really difficult experiences, often traumatic experiences of the end of life, and then further compounded by social isolation after the death. We found high-level needs for emotional and therapeutic support in this sample, and significant difficulties in getting those met, either through formal services or through friends and family. And based on our findings so far, we've made a number of recommendations for policymakers. So the first of these is around increased provision and tailoring of bereavement services to meet the diverse needs and backgrounds of bereaved people, including support which is culturally and crisis competent, and group support for those with shared experiences and characteristics. Second is to raise awareness and understanding of different support options and how they can help. Information on grief and bereavement services needs to be provided proactively following a death and made available in online and community settings. And GPs and other primary care providers, such as pharmacists, need to be better resourced to signpost to appropriate bereavement support. And then finally, following compassionate communities approaches, we also recommend expanded provision of informal community-based support and activities to help with the high levels of loneliness and social isolation experienced, whilst longer-term educational and society-level initiatives are needed to improve how we communicate and support people experiencing death, dying, and bereavement during this time. So we've been involved in setting up a couple of supporting initiatives. So we're doing some work around policy engagement and influencing. Marie Curie charity is involved in the study, in that my colleague Emily Harrop at Cardiff, who I'm leading the study with, is based at the Marie Curie Research Centre. Marie Curie is one of the major end-of-life and bereavement charities in the UK. And they've spearheaded the launch of an independent UK Commission on Bereavement, which launched on the 15th of June. You can see our Twitter page there if you're interested in joining. And the purpose of the commission is to consider the findings from this research and from other research nationally and internationally on bereavement during the pandemic, but also to look forward and consider life beyond the pandemic, so the next 5-10 years, and how these really difficult experiences of the pandemic are going to affect people over the longer time frame. And we're also going to be doing a call for written and oral evidence, which I can talk a little bit more about if there's interest in that. And that call is really flagging that both organisations in the UK and individuals in the UK have got a huge wealth of important material to share with the Commission, which will inform the report that they're going to be writing. And we're focusing not just on bereavement during the pandemic in this, but in the last 3 to 5 years as well. A lot of what the pandemic has done in the UK is to highlight existing inequalities and limitations and problems with the bereavement support sector. So this is a real opportunity to improve the whole sector and strengthen the work of the sector moving forward. And then on the public engagement side, so I founded a festival last year, and a group of us is involved in this, but we launched online last year. It's called Good Grief, and our next festival will be held in October this year. It's free to attend. It's an online festival, and we've got really incredible range of speakers have taken part now, so over 150 speakers. We also have the Grief channel, which is basically a portal for all of the public engagement events that we run via Good Grief. The aim of Good Grief is to bring grief and bereavement out into the open and provide opportunities for people to share their experiences and learn more about grief and bereavement. And you can subscribe to the Grief channel and access all of our previous content for £20 for 12 months. And you can follow us on social media. I'd just like to acknowledge everyone who's taken part in the research. My co-principal investigator, Dr. Emily Harrop, our research team across the University of Bristol and Cardiff University, our advisory group, which provides really invaluable support, our funding from the Economic and Social Research Council, and you can see our study website there. And I'm happy to share these slides, and I've put some references in some of the previous papers that I've written on this subject during the pandemic, and our emerging findings from this work as well. Thank you.
Oh, sorry, it's me. Thank you. Thank you for a terrific presentation and for presenting so comprehensively and amazing sort of research outcomes. Thank you. It's been very interesting. There were a few questions in the chat, and also I had some questions as well. But I might go to the first one, which was just a question about the sample that you sort of have obviously thought deeply about. The proportion of male to female participation, is that out of step with non-COVID bereavement studies, and your thoughts on why this is so?
Yeah, I mean, this is a very interesting one. It's actually the bias towards female respondents is seen in other bereavement research, outside of the pandemic context. I do think it may well kind of reflect our sort of cultural attitudes towards grief and bereavement, and the fact that in the UK, and I think this is probably true in Europe, I'm not sure about where you are, but there's just more acceptance of women talking more openly about these things, and men tend not to talk so openly and share their experiences as much. I wonder also if it's to do with recruiting through social media. It might be that women are more likely to use some of these online support groups, for example, and became more aware of the research because of that. Interestingly, there was a survey which came out in China last year, which was a similar online survey, and they didn't see this bias. So they had 55% of their sample was men, So this also made me think about the sort of gendered nature of caregiving. And in the European context, the vast majority of carers tend to be women. And I wondered, in China, in the Chinese culture, it's much more common for the sort of older son in the family to take on more responsibility in terms of organizing care, if not providing care, and providing and acting in that role as a spokesperson for the family. So I wondered if there was also it was also reflective of that difference too.
Thank you. Very interesting. Lucy, you touched on this a little bit, but there was a question around social media and its role. And you talked a little bit about supports on social media, but also the opportunity that it has to sort of, I guess, concentrate views and enhance beliefs or misbeliefs, particularly around fault. And you mentioned anger. Do you have any sense of the role of social media and whether it was a force for good or not in all of this?
I think it's very mixed. I think I think we probably all, from our own experiences, can see both the positives and negatives of technology and of kind of online communication. There's definitely online support groups that played a really important role in the UK. Partly, I think, because of this feeling that COVID-19 bereavement is so unique. People are going through something which they feel no one else really understands. And so that kind of coming together in private Facebook groups, for example, has been really important. And there's some examples of therapists actually tapping into those groups and supporting people, online through the social media groups. But then the flip side of that is some of the data which I mentioned around how upsetting it can be seeing, your friends and family sharing social media posts saying that the pandemic is being exaggerated, that the social distancing requirements are too stringent, that actually, we should all be free, whatever that means, and not observe all of these regulations. I think that's really, really hard when you've been bereaved. A friend of mine who was bereaved during the pandemic, Fatima, she talks about, she'd been attending like a Zoom funeral of her cousin, and then the following day in a supermarket, she asked somebody, she said, "Oh, there's a line there. Could you please kind of step back, to keep 2 meters between us?" And the woman started saying, "Oh, you sheep, you're following, requirements that don't need to be there," and that was extremely upsetting for her. And so I think what's been really clear in the pandemic is that we're all in the same storm, but we're in very different boats, and that really comes out that for some people going through lockdown, they've been on furlough, they've actually had quite a nice time, they've taken up new hobbies, whereas other people have had lost their job and had multiple bereavements in the same family and have really, really struggled. So I think social media plays a role in that, certainly. And
anger is directed sort of diffusely, or is it coming towards health professionals, or there are a lot of anger sort of?
I think it was very mixed. So I think at the beginning there was a lot of anger at perceived unfairness around, say, end-of-life care visiting regulations and restrictions which varied kind of geographically. And that came through in kind of media reporting as well, this sense of inconsistencies and unfairness around that. But actually in the UK, there was this real appreciation for the NHS and appreciation for healthcare professionals. So I think most of the anger in our survey was more directed towards the government, in the sense that these COVID-19 deaths in particular were avoidable. And that even where someone hadn't died of COVID-19, where someone hadn't been able to say goodbye or see their loved one prior to the death, that was also potentially avoidable. So there is a real sense of anger and injustice which comes through in the data.
It will be interesting to see if expression of that emotion as part of the grief is, helpful long-term or unhelpful long-term, or just how that plays out. There's another question, Lucy, you showed some strong findings around the difficulties people experience before and after death, you know, the saying goodbye, etc. Did you find any of those individual factors had a stronger impact on grief or indeed their vulnerability?
So we haven't looked at that yet. So we're in the process of writing that up and analysing that in more detail. And we will certainly be able to look at that. Offhand, I believe that the one factor which did seem to make a difference in terms of grief experiences was the social isolation and loneliness. That did seem to play a major part. But yeah, you'll have to wait and see. It should be coming out, I hope, in the next couple of months.
Watch this space. So I'm going to take the prerogative of the last question. What you were reporting on was as you asked individuals about their responses, and then your last slide was very much around, and your opening slide indeed was around societal and community responses. What do you see as being sort of the appropriate mix, or how do you see all that sort of playing out as in the best form? So individual care and help, and community care, and as a community sort of.
I think you kind of need to work at all the different levels of the public health triangle. I think there's work to be done at all of those levels. I mean, mental health services have been kind of quite poorly funded in the UK for quite some time now. There needs to be more investment in those specialist support. But equally, you know, as we've seen and as we're finding out in the second work stream, there is that patchy provision of sort of voluntary and community sector services. And we know that there are barriers to people accessing support, especially people from Black and minority ethnic groups, but also younger people and older people who aren't accessing bereavement support in the same way, those bereavement services in the voluntary and community sector. And then I think the community, at the sort of societal level, there's a lot that still needs to be done. You know, in the UK, we still are in a culture where people feel scared of saying the wrong thing, and there's a lot of fear around how to respond to grief and bereavement. But what we've seen through Good Grief is that people are actually really interested and have a real thirst for sort of more knowledge and engagement, and actually listening to authentic conversations around grief and bereavement, and that can help them feel much more confident in supporting others, as well as giving them the opportunity to have reflected back to them their own experiences, so making them feel sort of less alone. So I think, you know, technology can play a good role in that too, that, you know, with Good Grief, we've been able to bring people together online in a way that we just wouldn't have if it had been face to face. But I think in answer to your question, more needs to be done in each of those levels, and I don't think we're yet at a stage where we can say, well, that sector's doing okay, we should just focus on the community. I think there's still issues around access to formal services.
Okay, thank you, Lucy. I think we might draw it to an end. We've worked you very hard, and I'm mindful it's very early in the morning there. So thank you indeed for a terrific presentation and such interesting findings. And we didn't even begin to get onto your media analyses and things. So there's so much more we need to talk about and for us to go and read. So we're really grateful for your time and for being part of Perspective. So thank you.
You're really welcome. Thanks so much for inviting me.